If I were to claim, as the relativists do, well, this is my truth, I would in essence be saying, well, I think I'm right about this and I can't be wrong, versus the objective position that says, I think I'm right about this. I have excellent reasons for standing here, but I could be wrong. And that opens me up to curiosity and frees me up to not claim it as my own, but rather the thing that I believe to be true is it stands or falls apart from me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This program can be seen on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, I've mentioned this several times, and some of you have done this, and I'm really, really grateful that you go to the place where you get your podcasts and you leave a review. That helps other people find out about the program and get excited about it. So please take just a moment to do that. My guest today was an NCAA Division I gymnast, an award-winning journalist, and now a Summit Ministries speaker, speaks in other places, trains tens of thousands of people every year to see things biblically, especially related to the pro-life issue. Please welcome Megan Almon to the show. Megan Almon, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show.
I'm glad to be here.
This is historic, not just because you're on the show,
Okay.
and you're one of my favorite speakers, but because this is our first episode broadcast in the Mike S. Adams studio.
I didn't realize that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
are
This
the
is
very
such an
first
honor.
guest in this beautiful studio. So we're here. If you kind of maybe see a little bit of some of the buildings in the background, the Summit Ministries.
Yeah.
Grandview Hotel is right back there. There's students crawling all over it. I mean, not literally, but they're everywhere.
Yep.
In the summer programs that are taking place right now. And just on the other side of this wall is a control room where the people who are producing the show operate.
Yes.
And this is where we did the Summit virtual event last week.
Yes. It looks like Mission Control in that room.
It does
and,
look.
the best team.
I just asked where the hyperdrive button is. That's the only thing I want to know, because there are lots of fun. I love pushing buttons.
The red phone.
It's my favorite thing about getting a rental car is just push all the buttons.
That's right.
See what happens. But yes, so this is a huge thing for Summit Ministries, because we loved Mike S. Adams.
Yes.
And he passed away 2 years ago, and we've talked about that some in the media and other places. And the legacy that he left was one that you're tapped into as well, because he cared about free speech.
Yes.
And he cared about pro-life issues. And when you speak to the Summit Ministries students, you're often speaking on making the case for life, and also talking about relativism.
That's right.
And some other aspects of apologetics. So that's the direction that I want to go, which is like every direction all at once. But I'm excited to have the conversation with you, and excited that we can do it here.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, let's just dive right in, Megan. You and your husband, Tripp, both are part of the Summit Ministries team. You speak to the events. Tripp hosts the Summit virtual program, and then the two of you together host the Summit semester program.
Yes.
At Snow Wolf Lodge in Pagosa Springs, which is a Summit Ministries property. And we haven't talked a lot about it on this show, but it's a 3-month sort of gap year program for students before they go to college.
That's right. 3 months, wonderful months where they can pull back a little bit from popular culture and take a minute to assess it in a retreat setting.
Yeah.
Go very deep into the Christian worldview in a community setting. So they're learning several things at once, just really how to live life well, for lack of better terms, because it is academic, and it's community, and it's work, and it's all of these things.
It is all of those things, isn't it? Yeah, it's everything that you want to be prepared to do well, to think well, to work well, to have your life be honoring to God, to be able to understand the specifics of your design so that you can live that out.
Yeah.
All of that takes place. Well, that program is full for this fall.
Yes, but next year we'll already begin looking at applications, and next year, actually, as you all know, our 3-month gap semester is being extended to a full gap year, so a
Full
school
gap
year,
year.
2 semesters.
Yeah, so you could have a life-changing experience in this lodge in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, where you'll have the opportunity to learn from Summit's top professors, but you don't just get an hour with them.
No.
You get a week.
Days with them.
Yes.
And in a smaller setting, our class size will never probably be more than 40 students. And so we're talking about, eating meals with them, going on walks and hikes with them, sitting with them on the porch, having one-on-one time if you need that in this setting. It's pretty spectacular.
It's pretty spectacular. And the facility is surrounded on 3 sides by national forest.
Yes.
It's one of the most popular summer areas and winter areas, actually, in the state of Colorado. There's a ski facility near there that's always known as having more natural snow than any other resort.
That is their claim to fame, yes. Yeah. And it is quite wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for letting me bring that up because I realized we haven't talked about Summit Semester, but there's probably somebody listening right now who's thinking, either I am interested in that, or I may have a son or daughter or maybe a grandchild who could really benefit from having 1 year like that in community, learning to think well, read well, write well.
Yeah. Establish rhythms of life. Yeah. Understand the importance of work and creativity. Learning how to learn, how to ask the deep questions and to sit in them. So it slows things down quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just tremendous, and anybody can go to summit.org who wants to find out more information about that. But that's actually the second thing. We haven't told anybody yet that we're going to a full gap year.
That's right.
Until just now.
That's right.
It's a whole program of firsts. See how lucky you are. Well, let's just talk about some of the things that you've learned about engaging. We spent a lot of time on this show. How do you engage people with your faith? And this is something that you regularly do. We've already talked about the Summit Semester program, the summer programs at Summit, but you travel and speak as well and to all different kinds of groups.
That's right.
And some of the groups are not your typical evangelical Christian group. So you're always around people and always meeting people who are dealing with all different kinds of things in their lives. So I'd love to just process with you for a minute what that kind of engagement looks like. You always do it in such a winsome way, and I've always kind of wanted to ask you, when you meet someone, first of all, how do you overcome the kind of fear that keeps most people silent? I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't mean to judge anybody who's watching or listening, but a lot of people in fear believe they can't handle a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe what they believe. Yeah. And so they just sort of stay silent or withdraw. How do you tip through that?
I think there's probably a number of things that happen. Number one, just like we teach here at Summit, we believe that Christianity is objectively true. The only kind of true that matters, that deserves placing our faith in something, is that it should be objectively true. So I think the first thing is that if I'm confident in that, it means that any conversation I'm entering, I'm coming from not only a position of strength, which is something to remember, not one of weakness, right, but also one of humility, because objective things by their very nature can be right or wrong, can be true or false, unlike subjective truths, which are all equally valid. And in a culture that I think is trying very hard, this touches on a little bit of the relativism that we talk about here. I think the culture is trying very hard not to be arrogant, which is well-intended. Okay. But if I were to claim, as the relativists do, well, this is my truth, I would in essence be saying, well, I think I'm right about this and I can't be wrong, versus the objective position that says, I think I'm right about this, I have excellent reasons for standing here, but I could be wrong. And that opens me up to curiosity and frees me up to not claim it as my own, but rather the thing that I believe to be true is it stands or falls apart from me. So I tell students sometimes when someone comes to me and they challenge my faith or a view on a moral issue or something like that, it's almost like they came and said, well, I think that 2 + 2 is 5. I'm not going to get angry with them over that. I'm going to be curious. I'm going to go, really? I didn't know the alternative to 2 + 2. Like Common Core is the only way I know we can get to that. I'm kidding about that. My mom's a teacher, so all in good fun.
I think You've hit on something that I do hear a lot of people say. They'll say, well, I thank you for talking about truth, and I'm glad you found what works for you. But all I can do is speak my truth.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned relativism, people don't usually say, hey, by the way, I'm a moral relativist.
Not at all, no.
But they'll say, I think the best I can do is just speak my truth. Things are complicated. I see things as I see them.
Yeah.
How do you plant seeds in a situation like that?
Yeah, I'm thinking of particular instances of these conversations. I'm thinking of particular people. I think that's where just being curious in general about other people helps. Because as Christians, I think we should be the most interested people and the most interesting people, right? If God made all of this and he's infinite, we'll keep on learning forever and never exhaust the depths of it. But with other people, if that's the claim, the best I can do is live my truth, and I want to hear what that is.
Right.
Because I think what I'm getting at is, what is your, I'm borrowing a term from the Marvel Universe, what is your end game?
Right.
What is your ideal? What are you after, ultimately? And I want to hear from them what that is. And along the way, if I'm listening well, I'm going to pick up on some patterns of ideas and things like that. But because I care, and we should if we're asking that question. I can remember a conversation with a man who said something like that. He said, that's great for you and all, but I have 2 daughters. I was burned by the church. And I just want my girls to grow up and be good. Okay. Now, the problem is that the worldview he was espousing there had no foundation for anything good beyond his preferences.
What does good even mean?
Or their preferences, right. And so I think that maybe the asking of good questions there, I've learned a lot from friends, mentors, fellow Summit faculty along the way, thinking specifically of Greg Kokel's tactics from Stand to Reason, just the art of asking good questions to draw people out. And I think I can probably even give that bit of information. Do you realize that you say you want them to be good, but what you've just told me is that good rests on what you define or what your daughters define. So what is the good that you speak of? Yeah.
So he probably has in his mind some things that the good would be, or at least some things that would not be good if they engaged in them. But what's the foundation for that? Yeah.
Yes.
Greg's been on this program, so that'd be a good show to go back and review.
Yeah.
I think it was like 40 minutes long, a fascinating conversation, and he just gave some very basic strategies of how you engage in conversations with people.
Right.
People have different worldviews.
And he does that all the time. So.
And you don't have to be afraid.
No, just ask a question, because after all, we all share this human nature.
Yeah.
I think we tend to pit ourselves against other people and do the comparison thing, so we get really intimidated really easily. But the pro-life view that we would espouse, grounded in the larger Christian worldview, tells us that our value is intrinsic, just like the children we're trying to protect, just like the person that we're talking to who is angry. So I think sitting in and understanding the things we say to be true gives us a posture that's helpful.
Right. Okay, that's really good. This, I very rarely, of course, I travel a fair bit, and I'm meeting people in all different kinds of situations, secular situations, Christian situations, people who are searching, all different kinds of people. I almost have never had anybody ask me, tell me, why do you say that? Or why do you believe that? It seems like they're sort of, you say what you say, then they say, well, here's how I see that, which can make for a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
But it distinguishes the Christian if you can say, tell me more about that. I'm really curious to see, how did you arrive at that conclusion?
I think that speaks to probably G.K. Chesterton's Maniac, the first chapter of his book Orthodoxy, which is one in my top 5.
Yeah.
Always will be, I think. But he's talking about the fact that we do that. So that comparison thing I was talking about a moment ago, that we tend to kind of focus our attention inward. And we're very, very concerned with what others think. So I don't get, why do you believe that? I get, why should I believe that?
Right.
I get that more often. we tend to do the same thing over and over again, but the focus is on self. Even though that's not intended, we're suffering from egos that are, all over the place.
Right.
And Chesterton said the happy stranger, the land of happy strangers comes when you can look up and realize that those people are not that concerned about you. They're very concerned with their own problems. That's right. And it frees you to be curious about them. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah. I got to get the kids from school.
Right.
I got to make dinner.
Yeah.
I've got to try to do a good job at work so that I can move up and hopefully earn a little more money.
Yeah.
There are a lot of everyday concerns that all of us have. Mm-hmm. How do I pay for rising gas prices and all of those sorts of things?
That's a big one right now.
It is a very big one right now. But it seems to me, and maybe this is just the weird philosopher part of my brain, but it seems to me even very practical questions about how we live our lives, if we just scratch them just a little bit, the question below the surface is, how do I live a meaningful life? Mm-hmm. When I go to bed at night, and I was a single dad for many years, mm-hmm. I'm laying in bed thinking, I am so completely exhausted. After PTA meetings and sports and picking kids up and dropping them off in different schools and all of that, and making sure they did their homework and they're prepared for the next day, I collapse in bed, and there is the question was, did I do the best I could today?
Yeah.
I always want to be able to answer that.
Yeah.
But the question below the surface is, what meaning does any of this have? Mm-hmm. Do you think people are asking that, or is it just like, hey, look, that's just too philosophical. That's what happens when you get a PhD, is you start asking weird questions like that.
No, I don't know if they ask it overtly, but I think it's always there. Because I think that's what when I'm speaking to groups or individuals, I mean, that's what I want to tap into, is that part of them. They're going, why? Like, why am I doing any of it? I think about, I talk to our students here at Summit about beauty. Mm-hmm. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And we work with it, we define it, and we even address the part of it that is mysterious, because part of the question of beauty is wrapped up in us.
Right.
So it's going to be a bit of a mystery to us, but what we come out of that presentation with, because I call the presentation "Beauty: The Art of War," which is a weird title.
That is a weird title.
It
I
was,
like it.
yeah.
I'm intrigued.
I had to think about. I'll tell you about the opening of it that I had to come up with, because I was sitting here thinking, when I was asked to develop it, how do I talk about beauty to 16-year-old boys? Like, they're going to be like, are we going to talk about floral arrangement? Because I'm just not here for that.
Let's start by talking about how to take a shower.
Right. Or something.
Yeah. So yes. So you've got to wrap the audience into it.
Yeah. But what we come out in understanding is that beauty, because the Christian worldview has room for it, and even the mystery part of it, the things that don't quite make sense to us, the fact that when we encounter true beauty, it doesn't just bring us pleasure, it hurts us. Mm-hmm. And it awakens that longing that C.S. Lewis talks about in The Weight of Glory, and others have talked about it very, very well also. But when we are intentional in our day-to-day lives to cultivate it, and I make that a very broad thing. So I'm no longer talking specifically about beauty as, proportion and unity of form and content and all these things like Aquinas would, but more the idea of living beautiful lives, living faithful lives. So you as a dad, when you would go about the day and you're doing these things, and you didn't have to, but you do them faithfully. When a friend comes over and I pull real mugs out of the cabinet and we sit down for coffee. When my husband works on this Volkswagen Beetle that was part of our Summit virtual program this year that they named Roscoe, 1970 Volkswagen Beetle. He's been hours and hours. But anyway.
I actually did a lecture sitting in the car, driving around Garden of the Gods.
People thought they were filming some crazy movie, which, I mean, it's Manitou Springs.
Oh, it was fun. It was so much fun to see people's reactions. And there's something about a beetle that brings out all sorts of memories. But anyway.
It's just he's bringing order to something that was broken. Okay. He's repair to it. Mm-hmm. I talk about feasting. When we feast together, when we eat a meal together, which is a big part of semester and a big part of our summer program, that they eat together, home-cooked food, like from scratch. When we do that, and we didn't have to, we are cultivating these beautiful lives. Dorothy Sayers said that Jesus had a daily beauty that makes us look ugly. So tapping into, what does that mean? I think that infuses our day-to-day things, because when we do those things, we are pushing back the dark. Andrew Peterson wrote about that in Adorning the Dark. We are pushing back, we're fighting back, we're making a declaration of war against all that is broken in the world. And Christians are uniquely suited to be able to do that. Human beings have great dignity, whether they believe in God or not, in virtue of being made in the image of God.
Yep.
I mean, it's wonderful to see and watch, and we have artists who live here locally and all of that, but I think that for the Christian, there's this infusion into even the little things that gives them this eternal meaning, because these little acts echo in eternity because of our significance.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful thing to get a hold of. And I think that, when we're talking about any of these topics with students, with anyone really, I ask what the end game is, because most of the time the answer is something like, I want to live an ideal human existence, right? That's what we have in bioethics, all the questions about how we can attain immortality on our own, or how we can enhance ourselves so that we can be better than we are. These types of questions that Christians need to be part of these conversations badly, because there's good there and there's evil. All these questions, even in our question about, is our identity based on our sexual identity or something greater than that? Look, all of this stuff, I want to know what the end game is, and it typically has to do with living a life that is meaningful, living a human existence that has some kind of residue to it, some grounding to it that makes sense. And I often wonder, just like in the garden, when we dethrone God and we put ourselves on the throne and we start recreating ourselves as humans, the problem is that we'll never get that, because whatever we recreate won't be human anymore.
Right.
It's the abolition of man. So that beauty question, I think, just infuses great meaning. And if we can have conversations that look like that and tap into that, we have such a better story to tell about the world and about ourselves and about other people.
Yeah. There's so many aspects to what you just said that I'm still mulling over. I was even thinking about, I know, seriously, but even the scientific aspect of it. Robert
God made that too.
Who was the guy, at the Oxford University professor who sort of got modern science kicked off. He focused a lot on light, that light was this creation of God. We sometimes assume that, God knew the difference between light and dark, but we don't often think when he said, let there be light, that literally was, that's a scientific pronouncement. But light then is at the root of enabling us to grasp our world and understand beauty. So you can't even really wake up and go about your day without encountering some aspect of God that is really profound.
Yeah.
I mean, if light comes into your eyes.
That, and so I just went, because we're like springboarding off each other here. This is what happens when you pit people like this in a room together. I was listening to the philosopher Peter Kraft talk about Blaise Pascal.
Okay.
And Blaise Pascal, who was a contemporary of René Descartes, was watching what was happening. And Kraft says that Pascal was probably a bit of a skeptic himself, which maybe made him see more than others, because he was sensitive to it. But Descartes, in his great project, was trying to do the same thing with philosophy that had been done with science. Like, let's start by doubting everything. Like, let's make it very efficient. And so the problem with that is that philosophy needs a floodlight.
Right.
The Christian worldview is a floodlight, and you see the things in relation to all the other things, and Descartes was suggesting, let's turn that into a laser beam. And I've heard you talk a little bit before about, when you talk about worldviews and introduce students to worldviews, about what would it be like to look through a keyhole and try and see, rather than open the whole door. Something like that. And I think that when we have these, we're trying to be efficient, we're trying to make it work on our own, but we need the floodlight.
Yeah, that's really good. I love this. Well, tell us when let's say somebody says to you, all right, Megan, make your case.
Ooh.
Make your case for a Christian worldview. You mentioned this earlier. It's not just, do you believe it and do you find it interesting, but why should I believe it? That's sort of the question that people are asking. And on your website, you just give a little breakdown of something that any of us can remember. So I'm looking forward to hearing this, just making a B.E.A.R of an argument.
B.E.A.R.
B.E.A.R. So walk us through that, because we've got enough time, and this is going to be such a great way to conclude the show, because we can all walk away from this and think, I'm really prepared for any conversation that might happen.
Yeah, well, flying without my condensed notes. We'll just do this. We can do this. The B.E.A.R of an argument, I need those things to remember. I need hooks to hang things on. And so I love acronyms because it helps. It's selfish. It helps me. So it's interesting. This happened in a Catholic school in New Jersey. I was there giving a pro-life case.
Okay.
There was an exchange student from China who was fascinated by the pro-life apologetic, which did not draw on theology, but wound up there ultimately in the Q&A. And she said, this is interesting to me. Why should I consider Christianity? And I went to the one thing, because Paul said it's the one thing in 1 Corinthians 15. If this didn't happen, this historical event didn't happen, then we are of all people most to be pitied.
Yeah.
So this is drawn upon the work of people like Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig, who have developed this kind of minimal facts argument. What their project was to take all of the facts surrounding the resurrection, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of facts surrounding the resurrection, and boil them down to the ones that even the toughest critics of Christianity would accept as historical fact. So we have 4. There are some resurrection scholars who would use fewer than this even, but I like these to go with.
So let me back up for just a second.
Sure.
If somebody asks, why should I consider Christianity? In a word,
it's testable.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ.
It's testable. So
the word resurrection is going to be, that's where we're going to go with this.
Yes.
And Habermas says it's the most historically provable fact in all of ancient history. Now, you could read all of his books. But summarize for us where you go with it, the B.E.A.R.
All right. So the B in the B.E.A.R stands for the burial of Christ, which implies that he died. So we know that Jesus was executed on a Roman cross in a very graphic way. He was scourged prior to his execution, put to death by professional executioners. The Romans had perfected crucifixion. I know I've heard you talk about this. Yeah. They could speed it up. They could slow it down. They turned it into an art form in a grotesque way. And so Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which is what our historical sources tell us, which was weird. Because even for the gospel accounts to say that Joseph of Arimathea was part of the ruling party that had just condemned him to death.
Right.
It would have been an embarrassing thing to include, but they did. The account itself is very, very simple. Excellent reasons to believe it, but Jesus died, he was buried. That's the B. And so we look at that and we go, okay, that's one that we can count on. We know that Jesus was buried. All right. We move to the E. The E is the empty tomb. And I've heard Dr. William Lane Craig talk about this. He talks about the fact that historians get really excited when they find 2 different sources that corroborate on the same detail.
Yes.
Yeah, we have 6. On the empty tomb.
Wow.
It's like historical pay dirt. So the empty tomb, the fact that Jesus, 3 days later, the women went to the tomb and discovered that it was empty. Now, all of this, again, simple account. It's not embellished, which as a former journalist, I can tell you that that's something that if it's embellished, you're kind of like, okay.
You can tell in the way it's written or the way people talk about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's things like when I'm thinking like the Gospel of... Is it the Gospel of Peter or something like that? One of the ones that weren't included in the canon when the New Testament was put together, but it has these crazy details. It talks about like floating heads and, going to, and the giant cross
Peter
going to the sky.
And big and
yes. So this is a simple account, which would lend itself to its credibility, but also the fact that it was the women who found the tomb. That's in every gospel account. That's weird because women were second-class citizens for good or for not. Jesus didn't view them that way, but the patriarchal society that was Rome in the first century did. So for the apostles to be telling these accounts and talking about them would have been strange for them to include that if they were trying to embellish.
Right. You wouldn't have people identify the empty tomb who could not testify to that fact in court.
Exactly. So that it lends itself to the truthfulness. That's just probably what happened. The women found it.
Yeah.
The A in B.E.A.R stands for the appearances. So post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. We know that he appeared not just to individuals, but to entire groups. When we look at the 1 Corinthians 15 account, he talks about the fact that he appeared to the 12, which there were 11 then, but the 12 disciples, they called them the 12. He appeared to James, he appeared to Paul himself, and he appeared to more than 500 witnesses that Paul even says in that part of the scripture, go ask them.
Right.
He says some of them have fallen asleep, which is an aside, is just lovely that he would talk about death that way. But the rest of them are there. It was his kind of, don't take my word for it, go talk to the witnesses themselves.
Yeah.
Right, this is testable. It was something people could have investigated themselves and have, like our J. Warner Wallace and others, even since then. So the appearances. And then finally, the rise of Christianity, the R. Something has to explain that Christianity caught on like wildfire in a hostile environment.
Yeah.
That 12 largely uneducated men turned an entire empire on its ear.
Wow.
And the fact that they were talking about things that weren't what they believed prior to the resurrection. And when I read the scriptures, it took me a while to go back through and do this. I had a pastor bring it up and say, go read. They did not understand what was going to happen. Jesus was trying to tell them, but they were expecting the Messiah to be a military conqueror who would overthrow Rome so that the Jews wouldn't be the oppressed people anymore. That's what they thought. But the kind of Messiah that Peter started talking about at Pentecost was not that. Not a victorious conqueror of an empire, but the Son of God who conquered sin and death, which is not something they thought prior. So whatever happened brought these men out of hiding after their leader had been taken away to be crucified, which, by the way, meant wiped from the face of history altogether. That's what crucifixion meant for those who were taken. It was the ultimate embarrassment. Jesus he wasn't forgotten. I mean, I'll quote Peter Kraft again, he split history open like a coconut.
Wow.
That's what he
cool.
did. Not forgotten,
Yeah.
remembered forever. So something happened that changed not only the disciples, who all went to their deaths proclaiming this truth, but not only them, but James, his half-brother. You know, I ask the students when I do this, I believe I learned this from Dr. Craig as well, what would it take for you to believe that your brother was the Son of the living God? And they all laugh because they're like, no way. But rising from the dead, that might do it. So James was the leader of the Jerusalem church, one of the earliest martyrs for the faith. And then Paul himself, who as Saul sought Christians out to end their lives, to squash this whole movement. And on the road to Damascus had this conversion experience, this radical thing happened to him, to where he became someone who no longer introduced himself with all of his credentials. Like Paul had all the PhDs, right? He was Pharisee, Roman citizen, expert of the Torah, all these things in good with all the uppers, the leaders of the day. And he went from being that guy to the guy who said, I, Paul, slave of Christ Jesus. Because to him, that was the ultimate status.
Yeah.
And he said things like, the guy who had been shipwrecked 3 times and beaten and stoned and, lashed and who knows what else. It lists them all. But he would say things like, from prison, rejoice. Again, I say rejoice. He stood in front of the leaders of the known world at that time, the highest ranked people, and said essentially to them, you can do whatever you wish with me, but you will never have me.
Yeah. Right.
There is something about that. And the martyrs of the first century, you think about people like Perpetua, the Roman woman who died in the arena reportedly smiling. Like you can read her diary. Not that she wrote that part, but we have that historical account. Just powerful stuff. It gives me chills to talk about it.
Yeah. So it's the upside down kingdom. It's the opposite of what people expected.
Yes.
And in turn, you look at the profound impact of people in the course of history who believed that Jesus was the truth.
Yeah.
And not to take away from other people who worked super hard on their art or their inventions.
No, it was their great dignity that brought that about, I think. Something about them.
Right, yes, yeah. That they didn't set out to be the best scientists or artists. They just lived in the firm conviction that Jesus really was the truth. And the world changed as a result.
Yes.
That's incredible.
It is. And
so
then
the burial of Christ
was
empty
buried.
Tomb, the appearances.
That's the A.
And
the rise
of
Christianity spread like wildfire. And the thing about the B.E.A.R is, so that gives us 4 facts to work with. Again, Michael Licona, I think, does it with 2. So that would be another resource. He was a student of Habermas. But, and he's spoken at Summit, I believe, before. The thing about it is, when we look at other explanations that have come through the channels of history, things like the disciples stole the body, which is in the book of Matthew. It was the first thing that the guards were paid to say, the disciples stole the body. When we look at other explanations like the swoon theory, a naturalistic attempt to explain away that Jesus rose from the dead. He didn't really die, he just passed out. Even things like the hallucination hypothesis, that all these people who claim to have seen him, they really just hallucinated. Those explanations don't even cover the scope of those 4 facts.
Right.
Much less do they do it in a compelling way.
Yeah.
Which is the necessary ingredient for any good detective novel or TV show. Yeah. You got to cover all the facts, and you got to do it in a way that makes sense.
So this is something that people could take home.
Yes.
Today, and run that by members of their family even. So, gang, listen, this is something that I learned today. Let me run this by you and see what you think. And you can practice it. Yes. Then, as the opportunity arises in conversations, you know, I guess we're fortunate because you and your family live here in Manitou Springs, Colorado. I come to work. I live in Colorado Springs now, but come to work here every day. And spiritual conversations are pretty normal here. People are maybe new age spiritual, but they're spiritual. They like to talk about the things that they're experiencing in the spiritual realm. I don't know if that's probably not the experience of most people who are watching this or listening to this. No,
I'm from Georgia. So I grew up in the Bible Belt South, which had so much good to it. I miss the South in a lot of ways. But doing evangelism, to use that, just talking to people about my faith in the South was different because it was such a cultural thing to at least be nominally Christian.
Right.
So Tripp and I used to joke about the fact that we talk to people and it's like they got a Jesus vaccine.
Oh.
Like they got exposed to just enough so they're immune to the real thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it was a different way of reaching people. But here, the conversations do go a little differently. And people aren't surprised to hear that you're, a Christian. They're just kind of like, oh, that's great for you. They're just not that interested.
So here you're saying, let me give you something to think about you might not have considered.
Yes.
Whereas in other places, in your previous home in Georgia, it might be, if this is really true, shouldn't this change us?
Yes. Shouldn't it do something? That was Dorothy Sayers' problem in mid-20th century Great Britain. She was considered very subversive because the dogmas, the teachings of the church were being touted as old hat or boring. So like the progressivism of her day was where she was really trying to shock people with the teachings themselves, going, you're not paying attention. They didn't put Jesus to death because he was a bore. They did it in the name of peace and quiet. So she, her writings are wonderful. But I think something different today. We all have, those of us who follow Christ have our testimony. We have our experience, and that is a valuable thing to share. When you can pair that with reasons that other people can then grapple with on their own, like this, and that's the beauty of apologetics as a tool. An effective tool that helps them see what they weren't before that able to see, and maybe take a step in that direction. So,
this is really fun. This is just delightful to have the conversation, and I know that on your website you've talked about Daniel, in Babylon, and so it's your sense that we're actually in Babylon, really, that we're living in captivity, so to speak.
Yeah, in exile.
In exile. So the kind of the kind of approach that we need to have to our society is...
Oh, I can sum that one up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I would point you to, because my favorite resource for that book was John C. Lennox. He wrote the book about Daniel. I think it's called Against the Flow. And it is basically a commentary on the book of Daniel. This talk came out of something I had prepared for a pregnancy resource center banquet, because I wanted them to see how do we do this with the culture that we have on this issue of abortion, though much broader than that, on our faith. Daniel, as a young man, chose to engage. He could have chosen anything, entering those Ishtar gates of Babylon, like the gates with the golden animals etched into them. I think there's a copy of them in the British Museum.
Wow.
And I think about him coming from where he came from and being taken from his family. I mean, there's something about Daniel that frustrates me, because as a mom, I want like the commentary from his parents.
That's right.
Like, what did you teach him that he did these things, and his friends? I want their I want to give in your small group, and do dinner at your house. But Daniel could have chosen to give in. He could have chosen to give up. He could have chosen any of those things. And as a young man, 16 or so, scholars think, I don't know the exact age, he chose to engage. There was something about the residue, the foundation that his parents had passed on to him, that he set apart Christ as holy. And even going into this environment, he wasn't going to back down from that. The second thing that he did was that he learned the language and the literature of the culture, which was actually Nebuchadnezzar's military genius. When he conquered as areas, that Babylonian king would take the best and brightest to basically kind of like the Harvard of Babylon, and teach them the literature and the language of the culture. He actually changed the names of Daniel and his friends, as we read in the book. He was trying to take their identity from them. He wanted their names to be forgotten, but we don't remember his Babylonian name. We speak the name Daniel. He mastered the language and the literature, to where he was able to use their poets and their stories and point them to the larger story. And so that's interesting. I think sometimes as Christians, we shy from the language and literature of our culture, and probably rightly so. We shouldn't ingest a lot of that.
Yeah, some of it's pretty frightening.
But to know the stories and the songs is a good thing. I think it was Andrew Fletcher, the Scottish theologian. Was he a theologian? I know he was a politician. But he said, paraphrase, "Tell me who writes the lyrics of your nation, and I don't care who writes its laws." John Stonestreet tells us, the storytellers drive the culture. Third thing he did, he and his friends, is they chose to lock their knees when the music played.
Wow.
And ultimately, that's what we do. And they stood in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and they said, "Oh, there is a God who can save us. But even if he doesn't," and this I can't, I could just start crying. "Even if he doesn't, we will not bow." And of course, then he showed up in a big way in the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar was brought to his knees.
Wow. That's a great point.
Yeah.
So we want to engage, not escape.
Yeah.
A culture of silence is no good. A culture of fear is no good.
No.
And this needs to start now.
Yes.
So everybody who's watching or listening to this, we want to pray with you and for you that God will bother you with opportunities to come out of your shell and be bold and share Christ with others in the culture in which we live. Megan, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, Megan Almon, for joining the Dr. Jeff Show podcast today. You can find Megan's training materials, especially some of the things she talked about today, at prolifetraining.com. Now, Megan's work is supported through the generosity of donors, and a lot of people have asked, how can I make a difference on the life issue? This might be a way to do it. If you go to prolifetraining.com, you can click donate and then click on Megan's name, and then you can give a donation if you are interested in doing that. And I know many of you are. Psalm 145 says, "Our generation shall praise your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts." I encourage you to be like Megan, be that sort of person who everybody wants to talk to and then be that person in your generation who lives by the grace of God and displays the grace of God. Thanks for joining the show today. We'll see you next week.